Hello everyone, this is Mr. Schultz, and this is AP Biology video 0.2. In this video we'll be reviewing some chemistry, not all chemistry. I can't go through everything, but it will cover Biology in Focus 2.1 through 2.4. Again, this video won't cover everything that's in the textbook, as I don't have the time or the patience to go through how to do all of the chemistry that's at the beginning of the biology book. If for some reason there is a concept that you're still really struggling with or something that maybe you don't remember from chemistry, please feel free to come in and ask and we can go through it. Or if for some reason you want to just try looking it up, which is what I recommend, try a bunch of different chemistry YouTube videos until you find one that maybe matches your learning style or makes sense. Sometimes starting basic is better than trying to jump right into like some college lecture. But just keep in mind that there are lots of different resources out there available to you. But again, if for some reason you can't find one or you just want some help that's one-on-one, please feel free to set up a time with me and we can go through some of these concepts as well. So, chemistry, yay. I don't teach it, so this should be fun. I know enough about it to get through it, though. So, all right. So, the basics of chemistry. Matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. This is like 8th grade science stuff. Elements are substances that cannot be broken down to other substances by chemical reactions. So, elements can't be broken down into smaller parts without losing their properties. So, you can't take a gold atom and like break it down into smaller parts without it losing the properties of being gold. A compound is a substance consisting of two or more different elements combined in a fixed ratio. An example would be like carbon dioxide, CO2. There's one carbon atom and two oxygen atoms. Something that's not an example of a compound would be like oxygen gas. O2 is technically still an element. Now, there are certain elements in our bodies, in the bodies of living things, that are called essential elements. So about 20 to 25 of the 92 existing elements, the ones that we can actually find in nature, are considered essential elements. They're parts that are part of our bodies. Oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen make up 96% of living matter. So most matter is made up of oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And if you get to college and you study organic chemistry is studying about how carbon-based molecules interact with each other and things like that and are formed. Now, calcium, potassium, phosphorus, sulfur, and a few others make up about the other 4%. And they're what are called trace elements, and they're only required in very small amounts in our bodies. An example would be like iron, which is used for helping carry oxygen in our blood. It helps kind of help build the formation of hemoglobin, which is a type of protein. One of the things that the textbook mentions, and I think it's really important to know, is the evolution of tolerance. Some organisms have evolved to tolerate specific toxins like lead and arsenic. And a really cool example of this are sunflowers. Sunflowers are used in certain areas to help absorb some of these not so pleasant chemicals, because what happens is the sunflowers are able to absorb these chemicals and they don't actually affect the growth of the sunflower. So they're actually really helpful. I don't recommend probably eating the seeds, but I'm not sure how well these chemicals transfer into other places. But things like lead and arsenic, which are technically toxic, some organisms can handle them and others can't. I can tell you right now, you don't want to ingest a whole lot of arsenic. It's not going to end well. Our bodies are not evolved to handle it. Now, the structure of an atom. And atoms are the smallest unit of matter that still retain the properties of the element. So a carbon atom has very specific numbers. Specifically, it's going to have a certain number of neutrons, protons, and electrons. The protons and carbons are always the same number. Okay? Their neutrons can change, which turns them into what are called isotopes. And the electrons can change, which turns them actually into ions, either positive or negative ion. And some elements are really good at this. Some elements are really good at losing or gaining electrons, and some are just happy the way they are. Those are the noble gases. So the atomic number is the number of protons in an atom's nucleus. So if you're ever asked for an atomic number, not going to happen on an AP test, but just as a heads up, it's the number of protons. And the mass number is the number of protons and neutrons. Isotopes are different atomic forms of the same element. They have the same number of proteins, but they have a different number of neutrons. Carbon has 3 natural isotopes, 12, 13, and 14. Some isotopes are actually radioactive and will decay over time. An example of this is carbon-14. Decays at a very specific rate. We call that rate a half-life, and it can be used for radiometric dating of fossils. Some radioactive isotopes are used as tracers for medical imaging as well. So you might hear about using a specific isotope. I think cobalt, maybe, is the isotope you use for certain medical imaging. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that some isotopes like carbon-14 have a specific half-life, and if anything's older than the half-life allows for the mathematical breakdown of the actual isotope, it no longer works for radiometric dating, and so we stop using it. So carbon-14 is only good for a certain number of years, and then we have to use something else. And then we start usually using what's called uranium dating, which has a much longer half-life and allows us to do better calculations. But they're not super accurate. They're relative, and you have to keep that in mind. Carbon dating's pretty good, but uranium dating's a little wider. So just keep that in mind. Now, in chemistry, we talk about bonds. There are a number of different kinds of bonds, and they hold elements together. A covalent bond is where two elements are sharing their valence electrons, which are the electrons in their outermost shell. They can form single or double bonds. They are nonpolar covalent bonds. The electrons get shared equally. So sometimes they share the electrons and there's no pulling one way or the other. In a polar covalent bond, one element is more electronegative and it pulls on the electrons more, and we get what's called an uneven charge. So an example of this is in a water molecule. The oxygen's much bigger and has more pull, so it pulls on the electrons more. And what happens is because the electrons want to spend more time near the oxygen, it makes the oxygen a little bit negative, and it makes the hydrogens a little bit positive. And so this actually causes water to be polar. And this polarity is one of the most important properties in all of biology. In terms of chemistry, it's super duper important. Now, and we'll get to that more when we talk about water. Ionic bonds is when one element just gives up the electron to a different element. And the other element just takes it. And so what you end up with is one that's positive and one that's negative. But they're happy. Their shells are filled. And so they form ions, which are charged particles. Cations are positively positive. They gave up their electron. And anions are onions. And so we always talk about cations are positively positive, and anions sound like onions, and they're gross. Which is just my opinion. So that's a negative. And then ionic compounds are often called salts. So you'll see them oftentimes described as salts. So table salt, NaCl, sodium chloride, but there are other salts like calcium chloride, which is CaCl2 or 3. I think it's 3. Anyway, like I said, I don't teach chemistry. All right, hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds are when hydrogen shares electrons with an electronegative atom. The hydrogen becomes partially positive. This partial positive allows the hydrogen to form hydrogen bonds with other atoms and molecules. They are essential for life on this planet. Without them, life couldn't exist. Hydrogen bonds are what hold water molecules together and allow water molecules to have certain properties, but it's also used like in protein structure as well, where hydrogen bonds help hold the protein structure together. This usually involves hydrogen forming hydrogen bonds with either oxygen or nitrogen are the two big ones. Another type of bonding is what's called van der Waals interactions, and it's due to the ever-changing nature of electrons in the atoms and how they're constantly moving. The atom itself has regions of negative and positive charges because the electrons are constantly moving. Sometimes the electric charge is a little bit on one side and it's a little bit on the other side when the electron moves. And these interactions, even though they're considered somewhat like small interactions, can be incredibly strong. And the reason I have a picture of a gecko hanging out, he's actually upside down. And it's believed that van der Waals interactions are what cause geckos' little foot pads to actually hold on to things like glass. If you've ever seen a gecko in the wild, they're able to like crawl up walls and stuff like that. It's because they have these little foot pads and they create van der Waals interactions between their feet and the wall itself. So that's pretty cool. Now, molecular shape and function is incredibly important for biological life. So all molecules have a characteristic size and shape. And molecular shape in biology is incredibly important. It determines how the biomolecules recognize and respond to each other with specificity. So, an example of this is our blood type has a very specific protein markers. They're basically they're actually carbohydrates attached to proteins, and they tell our body that, hey, I belong here and I'm the right blood type. So if you have a type B blood type person and you give them type A blood, their immune system will immediately start to attack that type A blood because it has the wrong markers on it. And so structure is incredibly important in biology. It's also important because if we look at things like endorphins and opiates, the opiate receptors in our cells that help control pain and things like that, they have a very specific receptor shape. And what our body naturally creates is endorphins. So endorphins can be from things like feeling happiness and joy. But we use pain medications like morphine because what they do is they fit into that same receptor, and so they trigger the same response. And so what we see is we have certain medications that act the same as what our bodies naturally make. Another example is carbon monoxide and oxygen in hemoglobin. Now, our blood mostly wants to carry oxygen, but the way it's shaped is just right that if you have too much carbon monoxide, it actually fits better into the hemoglobin molecule than oxygen does. And this shape is really important. It's also why we put carbon monoxide sensors in our garage or in our basement, because if you breathe in carbon monoxide, it takes the place of oxygen, and instead of oxygen getting to your cells for respiration, you're getting carbon monoxide. Doesn't help really. Stop making ATP and you die. So molecules and their shapes are incredibly important. We're going to talk about shape of molecules consistently throughout this school year, but particularly in the first half of the year, because it's really important for a number of different functions. So shape and function are really important and closely linked. Now, chemical reactions are going to make and break bonds. Some important words to know are reactants and products. Reactants are what go into the reaction, and products are what come out. And in order to increase the rates of reaction, so basic chemistry stuff, you need to increase the amount of reactants, because if there's more of them bouncing around, they're more likely to encounter each other and react with each other. You can increase the temperature. By increasing the temperature, the molecules are moving faster, and so what happens is they're more likely to collide and interact and react. And then you can add a catalyst. Now, in chemistry, a catalyst is usually like a chemical that you add to the reaction, and it speeds the reaction up without being used up. At the end, you have your products, and your catalyst is still there. In biology, we use catalysts as well. Our bodies use catalysts, but we also use what are called enzymes. They are a biomolecule form of a catalyst, and they're usually proteins. And basically, their job is to grab a hold of the two reactants and then cause them to react, or to grab the reactant and break it apart, depending on the reaction. An example of a chemical reaction in biology class is photosynthesis, where we take carbon dioxide, water, and they get combined through a number of really complex, really cool reactions across multiple parts of a plant's organelle called a chloroplast, along with sunlight, because we need some energy to do all this, because you have to put energy into most reactions for them to work in biology. And it makes sugars, which the plant cells can now use for respiration and making energy, and oxygen, which is used in respiration for plants, but they make so much of it that it's usually a waste product for plants. So this is the end of the basics of chemistry. I'm sorry it doesn't go into depth about a number of different things. One thing you might want to spend some time looking up is how acids and bases work. I didn't want to spend a ton of time on it because it would have required this video to go even longer than it already is. So if you have any questions or concerns regarding the basics of chemistry for AP Biology, please let me know. Otherwise, we'll kind of talk about it as we go through some stuff in class as well.